You are listening to Action Design Radio, podcast of the Action Design Network, a globally recognized nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting all aspects of behavioral science. We bring you leading researchers and practitioners to discuss the latest behavioral science insights and how they can practically be applied to make a better world for all. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy today's episode.
Penn's Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program congratulates our instructor, Zarak Kahn, for co-editing the new book, Building Behavioral Science in an Organization, featuring MBDS Advisory Board members Charlotte Blank, Namika Sagara, Greg Schwartz, and MBDS alum Nicole Grabel. In the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program at Penn, students learn the theoretical and practical tools to address a variety of real-life problems and explore the science of decision-making using real-world applications and a hands-on approach. Check out our unique interdisciplinary program and see how you can start affecting changes in the world. Visit www.upenn.edu/mbds.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Action Design Radio. We have a very, very special episode today because joining me, as usual, is Zarak Kahn, but not as my co-host. We'll actually be interviewing Zarak with a very special co-host, Laurel Newman. Laurel, welcome back to the show. Why don't you do a quick introduction to remind our listeners of yourself?
Thanks, Erik. I'm Laurel Newman. I'm a behavioral scientist at Edward Jones. I was a psychology professor for a while, and Zarak and I wrote a book together called Building Behavioral Science in an Organization.
That is right. And what we're going to do today is continue our series of interviewing the authors of the book that you guys put together. And we're going to actually interview Zarak about his chapter that he wrote. So Zarak, welcome. And I guess to start, could you tell us where you are in the world? Because we used to have a fun way to start the show of where you were. And I think you've actually been traveling again recently.
Thank you. Great to be on the show.
It's great to have you.
And yeah, I know I'm super excited to chat with you all about the innovation chapter of our book. I am actually back in Durham, in North Carolina. I just got back, but yes, I was in Malta for about a month and in the Azores, but just got back. And so that is where in the world Zarak is right now.
Welcome back. It does make sense you're back because I thought when the time we're recording was 5 p.m. Central, and I was wondering if you were doing this at like midnight Malta time or something like that. So I'm glad we're not keeping you up too late, I guess.
Yeah, no such luck this time.
So for the subject of the show, we're going to talk about the chapter you wrote in the book about how behavioral science can be applied to innovation. So to get us started on that, could you define innovation for us and clarify what that typically represents in organizations? I think innovation can be sort of a broad term that can maybe mean different things to people. So let's know how you think of it and how we should think of that in the context for the rest of the discussion.
You're absolutely right that it is very broad. And that's one of the things that can make it challenging in an organization is that often everyone does have sort of a different idea of what it is or can be or what they're envisioning and sort of hoping will happen. And I've seen that most organizations will have sort of their own definition of innovation that is almost like a inspirational definition, and so it's like, we're going to change the future by shaping the whatever, but at its core, I think that innovation is generating ideas and then testing and implementing them in ways that have some sort of material impact to your organization. And there's a couple different ways of categorizing that work. And we talk about sort of two broad frameworks for thinking about innovation in the book. One is you can start to map innovation activities within an organization into three sort of broad categories. And those are things that you do that might make you look innovative, things that might help people that work within the organization to feel innovative or that they work at an innovative place. And then the third category is sort of related to the definition that I just gave, right? So I call that one actually being innovative, which is like generating, testing, scaling ideas. And so like looking and feeling, I think, are important for sort of different reasons. Looking innovative is almost kind of like a marketing activity in some cases. feeling innovative is often like a cultural HR kind of activity. And then being innovative is where, like, if you were on an innovation team, hopefully that's where most of your activities are spent, but not always. And then the second kind of way of thinking about it that we talk about is the ideas themselves that you're working on. And this is kind of where we talk about different ways of generating and implementing, testing those different things. And so those three are, is it an incremental innovation? So it's an idea that's just sort of tweaking something that already exists. And you can think of this as like a new product feature, right? The product already exists and you're adding some sort of enhancement to it. Or is it an adjacent innovation where you're taking an idea that exists in some other market and bringing it to your client base? So kind of what it is that you're doing, and you have a general sense of what you hope will happen when you introduce it. You can kind of gauge the risks and the potential rewards fairly accurately, as well as the timeline that it might take to do it and the resources. And then the third bucket is transformational innovation, where you're entirely, changing your business model, introducing a totally new technology or way of working or something like that. Most of what I see is, in terms of what people think of, is like the transformational ones. So they think of like, these really big kind of moonshot ideas, and like that's sort of what they think of as innovation. But there are lots of things that sort of fall into those other categories. And in most companies, the bulk of what they do are incremental innovations, not, of course, big moonshots.
So, Zarak, speaking of kind of how most organizations do it, among organizations that be innovative, what are the areas that people typically focus their innovation efforts and resources? Are there kind of themes that you see across companies in terms of where they try to be innovative?
So definitely in like product, for sure, like the products and services that they offer is kind of the natural first place to start. And whether they sort of are intentionally doing it as a strategy or not, they often start with incremental innovations there. And usually that's out of necessity, if nothing else. You sort of see that your competitor has introduced something where it's like a slightly new take on what you're already doing. And just to sort of maintain parity, you need to do something as well. So that is kind of the natural place. And then, essentially once you're making enough money, an organization will think of like, well, where are other things where we can like take bigger risks, invest more time or capital, and potentially get like a bigger reward or invent a new market or capture a market. So I think that's typically the path that those things take. And yeah, it usually starts with the sort of like incremental tweaks around product. But I would maybe like caveat that with most organizations that start like a innovation team or function probably are thinking more like along the lines of an adjacent or a transformational innovation. You don't normally start a team to do those incremental ones. Those are sort of an expectation that the product team or whomever is already doing that.
Yeah, that's sort of a question I've wondered about in terms of incremental innovation. What's the difference between innovation and just sort of, doing your job well? If I offer online banking and I'm always sort of improving the way that I deliver that, is that innovation or is that just sort of what you need to do? Is it sort of a philosophical line to you, or is the difference that you have people devoted to kind of researching forward-thinking questions, or is the difference that you test it? What do you think?
I mean, it's interesting, the question, of is it just introducing like new ideas, or is it actually, innovation? I would say like the answer is yes, right? Yes, you're introducing new ideas, but that is innovation. And it comes up, or I've started to notice it more in talking with senior folks within organizations who they'll often use the word disrupted, where they're like, oh, we don't want to get disrupted. And that has a pretty specific definition within like innovation theory and research. And what I found is that what most people mean when they say that is just that they don't want to get put out of business, right? But there's lots of things that can put you out of business, not just a disruptive innovation. Mm-hmm. And you can certainly get, you can lose market share to another company that has just been producing incremental innovations. So if my widget is a little bit better and it kind of increasingly like little by little gets better, all of a sudden people are going to buy that one instead of the competitor, and you can still lose out even without necessarily getting disrupted. So I think that it is part of people's, as you say, kind of like doing a good job, oftentimes should include like thinking about how you can improve the things that you work on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's an interesting example. It's one thing that comes to mind when you mention like you don't have to be disrupted necessarily is a lot of times it's like better design and honestly more behaviorally informed designs can be a big competitive advantage. You think of a lot of like kind of more modern apps and things like that that might be replacing old technology. There's not really new technology, but they're making them much easier to use. You know what I mean? So it seems like that's one area where it'd be that, yeah, thinking a little short term. It's like if you're not constantly iterating and making a better experience, someone else can have a better experience with largely the same technology. Would that be kind of an example of like not necessarily being disruptive, just kind of being beaten by iteration to some extent?
Yeah, definitely. Or, I think of like companies where they've maintained their position for a really long time, almost as like a regulated monopoly, where you just sort of have to use their products and you have to kind of use it the way that they, have always done it. And they haven't really had an incentive to change because they just sort of know, well, people need this and they have to come to us for it. And so, yeah, you're going to have to fill out all these forms or come down to our office, in person or whatever. So those are ones where it sort of tends to flip a little bit more away from like just sort of elements of design to things that are like actually kind of disruptive, where you have a new delivery channel, like an app, or something that's like direct to a consumer instead of going through a channel partner, where that disruption is more of a risk because you haven't had the incentive to innovate for decades.
So it's got to build on that and the incentives. What are some of the behavioral barriers to innovation? I think there's maybe a couple of ways. There's one area where like you're just kind of stagnant, like you said, and not evolving. There's another where maybe you're trying to be, but rather than, as the categories you put, rather than being innovative, you just look innovative or you feel innovative. Like maybe there's an intention action gap there. So what are some of those kind of barriers, and are there different categories of those barriers? Like I think in the chapter you mentioned, there's structural barriers and things like that. So yes, this tells us what are the things that sort of prevent companies from being innovative or being innovative in the way they want to?
So there's a couple things that you can think about. So one is it's surprising how often organizations lack a strategy. And it kind of reminds me of the line in Apocalypse Now, where he like finally gets to the end and he's like talking with Colonel Kurtz and is like, oh, they said that your methods are unsound. He's like, oh, are my methods unsound? He's like, I don't see any method at all here. And that is surprisingly like more often, you encounter that more often than you might expect, given the, the resources that people sometimes put or organizations put into innovation or innovative endeavors. And so without sort of clearly defining like what it is that you're trying to do, you don't necessarily meet the expectations because they're not really set to begin with. So that is obviously like a barrier, right? Like just sort of not even knowing what you're trying to accomplish in the first place and not really having a process to do it. There's just a lot of friction there, right? Some of the other things that I've seen that are kind of interesting are I have given a talk on behavioral science and innovation, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 times at this point, where I do like a little experiment with the audience. And it's basically like recreating one of Kahneman and Tversky's experiments on loss aversion and framing, and sort of positioned within the context of their industry. And so it's like, you have 2 options in front of you, and you can either kind of like take this riskier one, that's potentially like a bigger reward for you, or you can sort of take this kind of safer bet. And the results that we have, and these, it's not super scientific, right? It's just like, based on people's phone numbers, I randomize them in the audience. But there's a consistent trend over time that mirrors the results that they got. And my interpretation of that is that when you're in sort of like a steady state kind of positive frame, you don't take risks. You don't take risks in the same way as you do when you're faced with a potential catastrophe or big loss. And just sort of anecdotally, I've seen this with companies as well, where they underinvest in innovation or in innovation infrastructure until sort of it's a catastrophe that they're facing. And then you end up having to spend, probably way more money than you would have otherwise, or it's sort of an existential threat. So that's kind of an interesting behavioral one, I think, is that people tend to kind of ignore this stuff until it becomes catastrophic or potentially catastrophic for them. And then one other one that I'll mention that comes up a lot, we talked about 3 different types of innovation, of kind of the incremental, adjacent, transformational, and disruptive innovation tends to kind of fall under that transformational one, where it's like a new way of going to market or something like that. And it's a threat to your current business. And so the 30-second version of Clay Christensen's work is that it's very challenging for organizations to incubate those types of ideas within themselves, right? Because you're essentially creating something that cannibalizes your current business. The bureaucratic antibodies within your organization sort of spring into action and kill those ideas. And so this is kind of a structural one that you often face, where the antidote that he prescribed, right, is you basically take those ideas outside of the organization and incubate them externally, with the thought that as they grow and your current business sort of declines, they kind of, is a replacement coming in, and you quote unquote disrupt yourself.
That's a nice term, bureaucratic antibodies. I like that one. I was thinking when you were talking about people aren't very risky until they're really down. And then it's kind of like pulling your goalie, well, I mean, we're not going to win if we don't do anything. So let's give it all we got.
So it's interesting. I mean, that's such a consistent behavioral problem in all levels. Like at an individual level, we ignore things till it's a problem, whether it's like health, finances, things like that. And even these huge companies with all the resources in the world do the same thing. So it's interesting how that kind of natural behavioral biases we have sort of scale up even at that sort of organizational level.
Well, so I wanted to ask you about, you just gave an example of sort of moving things out of the organization and incubating them separately, because, there are a lot of bureaucratic antibodies. There are a lot of people who benefit from the status quo. There's a lot of fear of what if we create something that's meant to replace what we do, but it doesn't work and we've just undermined the thing that we do. That's a pretty tricky situation. In most companies, how do they handle kind of the need for these different types of structural groups that would do this? So maybe a structural group that's outside, that gets sort of moved outside the organization, but then you might have, I imagine, some people who are sort of doing incremental innovation who are sitting on teams. And then you might also have a centralized team of people whose job is innovation and they're not tied to a particular area. What are kind of the common ways that people design and organize the people who focus on innovation?
You have laid out sort of the bare bones of how that normally looks. And people kind of focus on different areas or may invest more in different areas depending on, what their strategy is, if they have a strategy. But yeah, so typically these incremental innovations live within whatever team is delivering that product or service already. So they, kind of comes out of their budget. It's people on their team that do the work. They run the experiments, measure the impact. And so if you're like a, corporate executive, you might give some additional funding to those teams, right, to create some more bandwidth for them to actually, have the time to go and generate some of these ideas and test things out, and a little bit more slack in the system for them to do that. And the reason for that is that it doesn't really make sense for a separate centralized team to come up with these ideas and then try to go and integrate them into an existing product. The coordination doesn't really work, and they're not necessarily going to be aligned on, roadmap and that sort of thing. So that is kind of how the incremental piece typically works. The adjacent one is, I think, can be sometimes kind of the murkiest, because you have to have some level of coordination with, an existing business unit or team that's delivering something. But typically the innovations or ideas that you're working on there are bigger and riskier, such that the product team itself couldn't take on the cost or the risk, or it's going to happen on a timeline that doesn't make sense for them. So that's usually funded more by a corporate team, and then you have this sort of centralized structure there. But I think that one is where there's often kind of the most friction, because the transformational sort of external team is again kind of insulated and off on their own. So in incremental and transformational, they're sort of doing their own thing primarily. They kind of have their own, their own budgets set, their own teams, their own timelines. The adjacent one is the one where I feel like it requires the most coordination. And so it can sometimes be kind of the trickiest, although not the riskiest, right?
So kind of building on that and sort of how different types of innovation can be structured in different ways. What does like an innovation process look like? How can companies kind of start building that? And the final part also, like, what's the behavioral science of that process?
So it often kind of follows, for the most part, right, the scientific method, as does behavioral science. So you typically start by generating or collecting ideas, and there are all kinds of like tools and tactics and positions that you might hire for, software you might buy, like all kinds of things to help facilitate that. And then once you have those ideas, right, you probably assess them in some way to sort of decide how we're going to prioritize these, which ones do we think are the most promising. And then, you design some kind of pilot or prototype and test it out. And then if it works, you scale it up more broadly. And so depending on the size of your organization and the types of activities that you're doing, you might have like entire teams that are dedicated to just like certain elements of this, which can be helpful, but sometimes confusing, right? So I'll often encounter folks who might mistake a specific tactic for like innovation as though they're interchangeable, right? So like, oh yeah, we have an innovation practice, we do hackathons or something like that. It's like, well, hackathon is a tactic that you might use to kind of rapidly go through some steps of this process, but it's not necessarily the same as, you wouldn't use those interchangeably. And so the biggest organizations, right, will have, sometimes entire departments that are dedicated to scaling successful pilots. And one of the places where I've seen organizations kind of fail in this effort is where they don't appropriately resource like all across that chain or that process. So they may put way more time and energy into generating ideas than they do into testing ideas. Or they may create a bunch of prototypes and then never scale anything. And so this tends to happen when there isn't really like a aggregated kind of holistic view of the process and sort of measurement along the entire journey. So you have a team that's just dedicated to generating ideas. All of their KPIs are going to be related to that. And so they're going to say, we generated 10,000 ideas, or over the course of the last 5 years, we've made like 500 prototypes. Amazing. That sounds great. What happened? Like this is always a question that you get in innovation, right? It's like, what happened? And you need to kind of have a pretty good answer to that, because it's not very compelling to just say like, oh, I don't know, or we handed it off to this team and nothing seemed to happen, right? And so I've definitely have come across organizations where they have dedicated time or resources to say like creating prototypes that never scaled. And basically you get shut down or you get kind of reorged, or they sort of re-envision what your role is, because you're not actually like going back to the definition, right? Generating ideas, testing them, and then like turning them into things that like have some sort of like material impact to your organization. They never actually translate to that impact. So that's kind of the process, and it follows pretty closely, I think, a behavioral science process for solving a problem, or a just sort of, scientific method, with the addition of this sort of scaling piece at the end, which is its own challenge, depending on what type of innovation you're doing, right? So incremental innovations on a digital product, pretty easy to scale. But for lots of other things that are more complex or don't, they sort of exist in the physical world, can be much more difficult to scale.
Yeah, it can be much more difficult to test too, right? So like testing something on a screen that happens in a minute is way easier than testing sort of a real life experience at a retail store or something like that. So I'm curious, in behavioral science, one of the things that I run into a lot is that people who don't really think about the science part of behavioral science think, well, I hired you because you're an expert. Tell me what to do. Mm-hmm. And then I'll just go do it, right? We don't need to test it. That's what you're here for. Because And I'm curious, in innovation, it seems like it's just a little bit more scientific, technologically advanced. Like, is it the case, because you've been kind of in both behavioral science and innovation, is it the case that you come up against less friction, you have more support when it comes time to test things, when it's sort of couched as innovation compared to behavioral science?
No, I don't think so. I mean, like you would hope maybe, but I think maybe it probably depends on the different types, what type of innovation you're doing or trying to do. Ideally, your project has some kind of like targets or measurement, like KPI, something that you're supposed to be hitting. I don't know that I would say that it's like experimental in the sense that like, it's not necessarily the case that you're going to be like running an RCT or, doing like a digital A/B test or something like that to measure it. But at a certain point, it has to typically turn into money for a company. And so like if that happens, whether or not you can pinpoint like what the exact reason was, it's like, great, that's a success. And if it doesn't, and you can't necessarily pinpoint the exact reason, it's sort of like, well, it's sort of a failure. There's kind of pushback on this, right? So if you're familiar with like the lean startup methodology, which a lot of innovation folks use, it has much more of an emphasis on learning. And so, it's sort of early stage stuff. It's like, don't focus on those KPI, like don't focus on revenue, don't focus on whatever. Understand why people are doing what they're doing with your product, because that is what's going to allow you to kind of unlock future growth or to know why something didn't work. So in some cases, like there is like a little bit more of at least ostensibly that focus, or it should exist there. But I don't know that it's necessarily easier to run an experiment. I would say though, I guess like I often borrow, this comes up a lot when I talk to behavioral scientists who are asking how to convince people to run experiments. And I borrow language from innovation world, and that does seem to help. So maybe there is something to this, where I remember talking to president of a company one time who was kind of saying, oh, we'll run some experiments. And they were like, well, we're not here to write an academic paper. I don't want to run an experiment. I was like, okay, well, what do you normally do? Like when you're introducing something new, like, well, we do like a phased rollout. Like, okay, well, like,
Right.
Let's do that instead. And like, how do you normally do that? Well, we just sort of, could we like randomly pick users or whatever? And like, oh yeah, we can do that. So there are ways of sort of, using the innovation language of, well, let's run a pilot. Let's de-risk this by understanding the impact, instead of just like, hey, we should really run an experiment so that we, measure the value or whatever. So yeah, maybe some of the language there is useful to borrow.
We've had conversations about that, just that term experiment, that there's some sort of negative connotations that come with it. Like you're just sort of messing with people, or you're just seeing what happens, or and it's obviously that's not what we mean when we run an experiment.
Yeah.
That's just the point on the language is really interesting. And I think it goes to show that doing these innovative things doesn't just happen overnight. It's in most cases sort of like a process of building organizations to the capability. And some of that's just like what people are comfortable with. So using pilot instead of experiment is one example of that. Then there's also just like start with what you can do in the short term and start building that muscle of testing and experimenting, for example. Like maybe you can't run a perfect randomized control trial right now, but you can at least just do like some sort of quick user test of something, or like just start doing something that gets that feedback and starts building that muscle and sort of meet people where they're at. Because ultimately, like when you think about a lot of this innovation stuff, it is a organizational behavioral change in a lot of ways. And behavioral changes usually start small. So we have to meet people where they're at for those.
Yeah. And there's interesting research on this too. And I feel bad that I'm not remembering the names of the academics that published these papers, but sort of two interesting kind of data points. So one is that startups that run more experiments tend to sort of do better, right? They are able to kind of evolve their products more quickly, and which is, what we might expect. And so, we use this a lot when we try to convince people to run experiments. It's like, oh, like run more experiments, you learn more, you kind of improve things. And there's even, I think, some kind of behavioral science behind this too. I remember talking with you, Erik, and Kelvin Kwong several years ago about running experiments. And Kristen Berman has talked about this too, where like, that's the first thing that you should build. It's kind of like this infrastructure to run experiments. And Kelvin made the point of you tend to be less invested in a single experiment when you're able to kind of have like a portfolio approach. And so there's like some interesting behavioral science there, I think. The other paper that I'm thinking of is, it's an interesting kind of counterpoint or sort of guardrail maybe, which is that we still tend to do what's easiest, right? So if the easiest thing is to not run an experiment, you don't run an experiment. If the easiest thing is to run a digital A/B test, you run lots of digital A/B tests. And that can lead to an overemphasis on these incremental tweaks when you could be investing more in sort of like these sort of bigger leaps or progressions. So there's always a balance to be struck, right? And again, kind of thinking about it from a portfolio perspective, this data is a couple years old now, but most companies like innovation portfolios used to look something like 70% incremental innovation, 20% adjacent innovation, 10% transformational. And then they sort of have shifted to be more along the sort of adjacent and transformational. So it's maybe more like 50% incremental. So if you look at like, if you build a portfolio of experiments or ideas, things that you're testing, not necessarily dollars that you're putting into it, but ideas that you're testing, and you start to see, oh, we've built this great infrastructure for digital A/B tests, and now that's like 90% of what we're doing, kind of be a signal, right, that you should probably adjust and invest a little bit more in some of the bigger swings just to sort of, again, kind of de-risk things for your organization.
Really interesting way to put it. Yeah, because this is a challenge I see. And I've actually seen this come up a number of times where people sort of like hate on A/B testing, for example. And they'll say like, you can't lean startup or A/B test your way to like a big successful company or something like that. And I've always found that like curious when I see those comments, because I'm like, well, of course you're going to like test and learn. And when I kind of like dig into those, it's because a lot of people have started to associate A/B testing with this very incremental changes, these very just like, let's test the buttons, system copy, all these kind of things. Yeah. And it's almost like that's what people think of as that, where, and to your point, and I see this a lot when I'm working within companies as well, that it's just it's just so easy to test smaller stuff and it feels more productive and it feels like we're getting things done. And that's not necessarily a bad starting point, but it's an interesting way of thinking about like a sort of innovation function or innovation expert. It can help scale that or tip those scales and say, let's do some of those things. Let's also keep these bigger things in mind. Because yeah, in my mind, the definition of that's much broader. You should be testing really big, important questions, but that's hard to do. And it takes a little bit of forcing function and good infrastructure to do that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think it also is like the more mature organizations that I think of that do lots of A/B tests. So one, they try to have more theory behind it, to Laurel's point from earlier. So it's not just like, hey, let's just try some random things and see what works. But they also build kind of like a knowledge management system around it too, that forces people to, when they're like coming up with ideas to test, to also think about like the expected effect size as well, right? And I think this is actually, I hadn't really thought about this until this conversation, but I wonder to what extent like that incremental focus has been like a kind of vestigial remnant of like a lot of experimentation in companies has come from academics joining companies, and academia is so focused on statistical significance, sometimes over effect sizes, that like they're testing things out to see like, did it change the needle? Like, are more people signing up for this or that? But not necessarily thinking about like, what's the effect of doing this? And so I think that the companies that are a little bit more mature have started to like kind of force you to at least make a guess in advance. And if it doesn't meet a certain threshold, then you don't even invest in the test.
Yeah, that's what I was going to think. I know back when Steve and I were at Morningstar, we had talked about practical significance, that like what's actually useful and worth our time as because to your point, like in a lot of like academic researchers, like you're trying to find any effect, like any interesting effect in a bunch of data or something like that. But in a more organizational setting, you're looking for things that move the needle and that are worth the time. So we always thought about, what's that effect you need to see to make this worth doing? And let's like swing at things that can do that. And doesn't mean you're going to get that. Most things are not going to get that, but at least you're starting to target your priorities in a way that aims a little bit bigger to getting this thing that you're looking for, right?
I think a lot of companies can be sort of victims of their own lack of delay of gratification, right? Their need for something immediate now. Like we ran this many tests and we found 5 effects and So you can run all these digital tests where you say, let's make the button red over here and let's make it blue over here. And let's make the font this way here and this way here. And let's move the box vertical versus horizontal. Maybe you find that you get this tiny bit of lift when you do it one way versus the other. But if you're selling a product, for example, like if there's a way to make your product better, or if there's a way to sort of create a new version of a product that works for a different market, like they're just completely different ways of thinking about innovation. And it's so much easier and faster to do those little sort of web page tests that don't carry much risk and don't really require a lot of often innovation, to be honest. Sometimes it's just sort of like a true A/B test. We'll use A and we'll use B. Well, I think we want to try to leave our listeners wanting more. So we'll probably start wrapping it up here. I wanted to ask you, Zarak, so in the realm of meta innovation, what is innovative in innovation? What do you see kind of around the corner?
That's a great question. And it's interesting because it is so, going back to my thought from a little while ago of like, it does tend to follow just like the scientific method. And so there's not necessarily a lot of changes there, other than I think you see more investment in sort of like rigor around innovation, like the measurement side of things, and more sort of thoughtful investment in innovation infrastructure. And so it's kind of like in like nonprofits and NGOs, like people want to donate to like a direct cause. They don't want to donate to like quote unquote overhead, but without like the administration of the nonprofit, like things just sort of go off the rails.
Right.
And I think that's kind of the case sometimes in innovation too, where it's like people, organizations, they want to invest in ideas, not the infrastructure that you need to actually generate, test, and scale those ideas. And so I think that you'll see like a kind of a more of a shift there to investment in that infrastructure itself, because without it, everything's just sort of like slower and more haphazard. And so it's basically just luck. There's not really like a process to it.
Right.
Yeah, it makes sense. It sort of builds on there. Kind of think about what's easier, what's the easier things to do. And the more you can make the important things easier and incentivize those, the more likely they are to happen. So kind of innovation choice architecture, if you will.
Definitely. I mean, like in the experiences that I've had, I like to use kind of anything as like a learning opportunity, but I've never really liked being in the position of going to bat for like a specific idea, more over just being like, we should create a process to like generate and test lots of these things, or validate lots of these things, I guess I should say. So, of course, within that, once you have a portfolio, you can kind of like, or like options to choose from, you can kind of be like, oh, I think for these reasons, I think that these ideas, this subset of ideas is what we should pursue. But yeah, I've always, in an innovation role, I think it's often better to advocate for building out a robust process and infrastructure instead of like putting all of your kind of innovation credits on the line for a specific idea or technology.
So final question, sort of putting all this together, if someone's listening to this and they're interested in behavioral science and they're also thinking, well, innovation sounds really cool, how would you recommend they get started in it and start doing innovation work?
It's interesting. Like, I don't know of like a really like direct career path that leads to like an innovation job.
Like behavioral science in general, I guess.
Yeah, it is kind of similar. It's like I'm trying to think of like a really practical advice that I would give, I guess. So if I knew some behavioral science and was interested in like wanting to get an innovation job, I mean, there are groups that, meet to do like innovation, like conferences and that sort of thing, like industry groups. And so I would probably like start kind of scanning those. The one that I'm most familiar with is called Innovation Leader, and I think that they're great. I mean, a lot of this is sort of my personal background, it's my background as well as a lot of other folks that I meet are former management consultants. Like they've done some sort of like consulting and then they end up going into like innovation within a company. The other path is like basically like hard sciences or like a technologist if you're trying to like develop a new thing. And if you're sort of just like administration of innovation stuff, then that sort of like consulting skill set seems to be like a kind of a pipeline that I've seen to innovation.
It sounds like the way you described it too, like innovation doesn't necessarily have to be its own function. It can be sort of done and built up from a lot of different parts of the organization too. So might be an opportunity too, like whatever roles you fit into or tend to be into, you can sort of spark innovation from there and maybe turn that into kind of a innovation role as well.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. And I'm glad that you made that, because what I described was really a path to a centralized innovation team role. And to Laurel's point earlier, like it's just sort of good practice to be, innovative in whatever role that you're in. A lot of times the word that organizations use is like consultative. They're like, oh, we want you to be more consultative in this, right? And that basically means like, we want you to like sort of ask a little bit more a few more questions, like understand like why this is important, probe a little bit more, be a little bit more thoughtful, come up with your own ideas and have some initiative of like kind of testing them out or building a case for it. And that is kind of like being innovative within your own role. So I'm glad that you made that clarification, because you can bring this type of thinking into any job.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great note to close on. Before we say goodbye, where should people learn more from you, get in touch with you, learn more about your work, anything like that? Other than listening to our many
all
other
this
episodes.
podcast, right? I don't know. The best place is probably like, I guess on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, but I don't really use it that much. So I would say LinkedIn or this podcast, Action Design Stuff, get involved with action design. And if you're more interested in this, as Laurel said, we saved a little bit as well. So you can find the book on our website, our action design website, for free. You can download a digital copy for free, or you can, if you want a paperback or something like that, you can buy it on Amazon. Those are my plugs, I think.
Thank you for having me. It's been delightful sitting in your chair, Zarak, and catching up with you both.
You have been an amazing co-host for the podcast, so we'll keep you on speed dial.
All right, thanks.
Won't be the last. All right. Well, thank you, Zarak. Thank you, Laurel, for joining us, and we will see everyone again next time.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Erik Johnson and Zarak Kahn. All podcast episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and many other platforms where you might typically get your pod on. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network, a nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading awareness about behavioral economics, psychology, and all things behavioral science in order to help you improve your life, your career, and your understanding of the world around us and the people in it. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once again, that's action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States and Canada. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Thank you again for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.